Dear Jean, I often wish I were as young as you and made from the same piece of cloth as you are. I'm sure I sit around and worry about what's undone, and all I need to do while you pull your bootstraps tight and go do it. Sometimes it seems I'm staring at my own mortality, which makes me wish I'd live my life not as I did, but as I should have. My conscience doesn't just twit me, it picks up a shovel and whams my head. I would never have missed Lou, but I often wish we'd lived closer to my family, though I still don't always manage to feel as charitable or forgiving as I should be. I'm beginning to feel like Sister did about the time she died. Maybe, maybe they won't open the gate and let me in. I'm so glad you're doing and feeling better. Splurge a little. Maybe ice cream on your birthday. And know I send you best wishes every day and much, much love. Always. Sweetie. These are excerpts from the very last letter available from Catherine Frances Demery Graham, aka Sweetie, dated November 1st, 2007. It was a letter that Catherine struggled to write to her closest friend, her elder sister, Jean, suffering from Parkinson's disease in the last years of her life. The blue pen is shaky, uncertain, evidenced by the letter's handwriting, so different from the elegant script she had for most of the rest of her life. Looking back, she faced her end of life with regret. Not long after this letter, Catherine suffered from more physical issues, and by the time that she passed away in 2009, her mind had been lost as well. In a state of dementia at the end of life, family unrecognizable to her. She died at home in bed at 86 years old. Her sister Jean passed away 2 years later in 2011, the last remaining child of Dr. Chester and Laura Demery. Jean had no children, so nieces and nephews went to Iowa to look to her belongings. Catherine's son, Louis, had only one request in this regard, that he retrieve the letters that Jean had saved, including all of his mother's letters, which he knew Jean had kept. The letters were sent to him, and he stored them in the attic of his parents' former home. Safe, but out of sight for over a decade. Everything changed in 2023. In the spring of that year, I, Catherine's granddaughter, went up to that attic when my father indicated that there were some family papers stored there. Having spent time in the past decade looking through genealogical records, I anticipated perhaps a few additional documents, maybe some photos. What I did not anticipate were boxes and boxes of old cylindrical plastic newspaper bags tightly packed together, filled with letters, many with their original envelopes. I asked my father what all the content was. He indicated, "They're my mother's letters, and some more besides." For several days, I sorted the letters I'd found and realized I had a great volume of letters from the 1970s and 1980s, and some from the 1990s. Another box contained the 1960s, and some from the 1950s. I went to my father's house and indicated how big the collection was, and at this point he responded he still had a box with him at his house. It contained mostly letters from the 1940s, and the 1950s, the other portion. I added those letters to my sorting, stepped back, and thought about what I was seeing laid out in front of me. It's difficult to describe what seeing this collection for the first time was like. The volume was astounding itself. Thousands of letters, single-spaced, handwritten, and typewritten. Various stationery, carbon paper carefully packed into small envelopes. Pages and pages of content that could take a lifetime to review. Pages and pages of content that was a lifetime in review. And almost all of them signed the same thing over and over again. Love, sweetie. Love, sweetie. Love, sweetie. My grandmother's whole life, displayed in paper, on the living room floor. I studied history in college. I have my undergraduate degree in it. I've continuously worked to enhance my skills through the graduate degree I finished in a related field. To work I've done on my own time to study various events and people. For anyone working in the field of history, any historian would hope to have a fraction of the primary source material that lay in front of me. It would be deemed a treasure. But this was over 60 years of material, sometimes at a pace of more than a letter a week, with minute details of everyday life. I tried to think of any other collection I knew of in existence that had been similarly reviewed. I thought about David McCullough speaking of letters and diaries of John Adams and letters between Harry Truman and his wife. But these were famous individuals. As to the lives of common people, sure, maybe I was aware of Civil War soldiers who had kept diaries during the war that were in print. But 60 years? And 60 years of life in the latter half of the 20th century, from World War II to the end of the century, from a perspective of a woman. I couldn't think of anything to compare it to. I was stunned. And then also letters from the 1940s to the 1960s of my grandmother's parents. Detailed letters from her father, who was a doctor in Iowa. Information about medicine at that time, packed together with everything else. A treasure in itself for any historian in the field of medical history. And the most amazing thing between my grandmother and her father, the doctor, they could write. They could really write. Every letter reads like a novel, no matter how big or small. Every phrase planned, as if they wrote with a mental outline at all times, and how they must have needed to, because they couldn't just delete on a screen a passage they'd want to rewrite. They were writing by hand and on typewriters. Every passage carefully planned. Not just surface-level information, but deep, detailed thoughts and descriptions. I looked at the collection on that living room floor and realized what I had. The greatest treasure that I would find in my life. My grandmother, gone for over a decade, suddenly, shockingly, brought back to life in the present through documents. But what to do? I started speaking with friends and colleagues about this astounding discovery. They all thought I might publish the letters, but how to handle thousands of them? And then one day at work, speaking with a colleague to whom I owe credit to the idea, Allison, this is a podcast. A podcast. Right, a podcast with unending volume of content. A review of a life. Plans were set in motion. But I couldn't possibly set out on this project without understanding where my grandmother was from. So about a month later, I took a scheduled vacation with my father to drive round trip from about 30 hours from Pennsylvania to Iowa, where he was born. To see where my grandmother was from, where my great-grandfather had worked, to go to that little town in Iowa they loved so much, to Lacona, just south of Des Moines. My father, standing in that little town, saying to me, I thought the last time I was here years ago that really was the last time. And yet here I am again, one more time. At the time, we had stopped to just see the town where their house had stood, as it's gone now. I don't think anyone knew who the two outsiders were. If anyone passed by, perhaps they just wondered why there was a vehicle with Pennsylvania license plate stopped in the middle of their little town, and its occupants just wandering about a bit. We returned back to Pennsylvania, and I continued my work reviewing through the earliest letters. Planning this project. And that leads us up to the present. It's finally time to begin. The preparation for this podcast is over. After all, as Sweetie would later say, Tempest is fidgeting. So how does the podcast, this project, a study of life and undertaking in the field of history, work? I don't know of any podcast like it. When speaking with others, they hadn't heard of anything like it either. This is the structure. That each episode would range between 30 minutes to an hour. That myself and a friend, who's the co-host, Jamie, that we would go through a number of letters each episode and react to them and comment on things that have changed from the past and see what it informed to the present and to the future. The letters were to be voice acted. I would handle my grandmother's letters. My father would voice act his grandfather's letters, as one of the only people from his generation still alive who knew what his grandfather Chester sounded like. And also, there's something amazing about the genetic descendant giving voice to their family members' words. Over time, others would handle the other characters of the story. We wanted to talk about how things have changed in the last several decades, what we've lost as a society, what we've gained, what we can all do better. My grandmother brought back to life each week and proceeding with her life in the moment she is in at the time of the letters being read. No spoilers, no indication of what's to come in future letters. The audience discovering a life as the letters move forward in time, an American life, all of its highlights, and all of its imperfection. A life completely of its time, with its moments, good or bad. With the language of its time, good or bad. Catherine was of her time, as everyone is in their own time. A product of the environment, good or bad, at times. Because at the end of the day, Catherine was human. And that's what history really is, a study of human events, human lives. And in working to understand this life, perhaps we can all understand much more about our own. So the main character, Sweetie, is my grandmother, Catherine. She was born in 1922 in Ringsted, Iowa. The letters for the podcast begin in 1941, when she's 18 years old. Her father, Dr. Chester Demery, MD, was born in 1886. His letters begin in his mid-50s. Catherine's mother, Laura, also born in 1886, was a nurse. Catherine had 4 siblings, 2 brothers and 2 sisters. Her brothers were Robert Chester and Frank Edward. Her sisters Margaret and Velma Jean. Margaret was commonly known to the family as Sister. Velma Jean was always commonly called Jean. And Catherine and Jean were the closest of friends, keeping secrets from the world, but none between each other. We find ourselves at the beginning of the podcast in 1941. Catherine has just recently finished high school and is attending Parsons College in Fairfield, Iowa. Today, Parsons is no longer in operation, but she provides some great details of life at that school at that time. She has a boyfriend named Ed. World War II has begun overseas, but the United States has not yet entered the war. A few notes about the town of Lacona, as well as about Iowa, especially for people outside of the state of Iowa. Unfortunately, Iowa is known as a flyover state, for many especially who live in the more densely populated coasts of the country. But just to start with the geography, Iowa is rectangular in shape, with its western border carved by the Missouri River. Nebraska is on the other side. And its eastern border carved by the Mississippi River. Illinois is on the other side. Minnesota is to its north and Missouri is to its south. Its capital, Des Moines, is almost directly in the center. About an hour's drive south of Des Moines is the town of Lacona, Iowa, in Warren County, with a population now of about 400 people. The towns of Indianola to its north and Sheraton to its south are nearby. And it should be noted that about an hour drive east of Lacona, in the southeastern part of Iowa, is the city of Ottumwa, with a small old airport nearby. Iowa is nicknamed the Hawkeye State, and it also has to be noted that Iowa is the highest producer of corn worldwide. With this, the Love Sweetie podcast begins. I hope you join us on this extraordinary journey, regardless if you start listening at episode 1 or at some future episode. There's really just one thing left to say. In a number of letters, Sweetie would write to her sister Jean, "Jean, this is between you, me, and the Gatepost," meaning that the things she wrote within the letter were to be kept in confidence by her sister. But my grandmother and Jean passed away some time ago. And after all these years, the gate has been flung wide open. For more information on the Love Sweetie podcast, please also check out our website at www.lovesweetiepodcast.com.